Well, this morning's lecture is the 21st Women's Studies lecture that we've held in this, our 50th anniversary year. This is the year we're celebrating 50 years of United Seminary. So I looked back. It's always empowering, particularly for women and what's happened to women in the last number of years, to look back at our history and at United in 50 years. And I want to share with you a little bit of that. There were no women in the first classes at United Seminary. 2 women enrolled in 1969. One of them is here today. Mary Ann Murray was one of those 2 women. And Marilyn Creel was the other, correct? Right? Today, 68% of our students are women. So, and what has happened to women's studies in that same period of time? It's grown exponentially. And also, the diversity of women's studies has expanded. So I just want to take a couple of minutes to thank those women students who paved the way for the rest of us, and to thank our faculty who have expanded this field through their teaching and through their scholarship. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Reverend Jim Germanian, trustee of United Seminary and senior minister of Plymouth Congregational Church.
Thank you, Carolyn. With your permission, actually even without your permission, I will excuse myself from the usual duties of an introducer, the mention of the speaker's schools and degrees and honors and publications. Marilyn Salmon did a wonderful job of that and more last night. If you weren't here then, you need to know 2 things. First of all, that much of that background is in your program, and second of all, you missed a hell of a lecture. So I would speak of another side of Beverly's story, the side that I am privileged to know as a friend of nearly 43 years. Beverly and her husband Bill and my wife Sam and I, and also our friend Renita Sheasley Banks, who is with us here from Virginia today, were all students at Union Seminary in New York in the early 1970s, which, if I have it right, was sometime in the Pleistocene, I think. We ate together at cheap but good restaurants on the Upper West Side, shared classes, participated in one another's weddings, birthed our children around the same time, and wondered individually and together what our lives might hold in store. Now we know, at least a big part of it, and there have been days of wondrous light and nights of hard darkness, and through it all, one of the chief blessings has been the constancy of our friendship. So last night as I listened to Beverly, what I felt was an unreasoned sense of pride. Unreasoned, since I wasn't doing anything but just sitting there, but I felt usually when I talk, there's music. It just fills the air. But I felt proud, really proud, that a friend of ours had accomplished so much in her field, that she brings such engaging curiosity to dense topics, that she nurtures and then shares such startling ideas, that she possesses the rigor that marks a true scholar, that she makes muddy things clear but also reveals the complexity beneath that which we always thought was so simple. I am immensely proud that this friend of ours has made such a contribution to the church, that she routinely breaks new ground, that she wields her intelligence as a tool rather than wearing it as a crown, and that she does all of this in as an unassuming way as I can imagine, and with humor that lights it all up. How do we give thanks for our friends, especially those friends who, with grace and with patience and ineluctable love, have seen us through our whole lives? There are no words, and there are only nods and embraces and smiles, lifted up, held, made holy. So I know we're all eager to hear what Beverly has to share with us today, so please join me in welcoming my friend, Beverly Roberts Gaventa.
Love these people. And he has unnerved me so that it's going to be a challenge here just for a minute while I collect myself. Of course, some of you know Jim well enough not to believe much of what he says. Where we are influences what we hear. For the most part, if and when we hear Paul's letter to the Romans being read aloud, we are in a setting of worship in a more or less quiet church. Prayer and music precede the reading, a sermon follows. Our own hearing of Romans or any other biblical text can be quite removed from the busyness of the world. When the world intrudes in the form of a siren outside or a cell phone inside, we notice it. This is emphatically not the model we should have in mind when we ask what it might have been like for Junia and her sisters to listen to Phoebe reading Romans. In the first place, remember who is present. We are with a small group of people meeting in someone's home. There may have been several such cell groups that gathered around the city. Romans 16 mentions the church that meets in the home of Prisca and Aquila. And assorted greetings make scholars think that each greeting may go to a specific congregation. Some of these groups probably consist of Jewish Christians, or what we would call Jewish Christians. Others consist of Gentiles. Although this is a hotly contested issue, my own judgment is that most believers in Rome come from among the Gentiles who have earlier been attracted to the synagogue. Synagogue groupies, I call them. They're not new to Jewish practice and teaching, including Scripture, but probably they are not proselytes, full proselytes. In addition, as I mentioned last night, a large proportion of Phoebe's audience probably consists of slaves or former slaves. This can be determined by their names, the names that were reserved for slaves, like Ampliatus and Hermes and Persis. And quite apart from the names, most reconstructions of the population of the Roman Empire in this period put the percentage of slaves at roughly 40%. 40 of the population. So slavery was ubiquitous. At least slaves will have been fed and clothed and housed in order that they might continue to produce. For freed men and women, life might have been even more precarious. Where are we? Where are we gathered? Some scholars imagine that we are meeting in a domus, a private dwelling, perhaps even a large home. Others think in terms of cramped tenement-style apartment buildings. The answer to that question, of course, makes a great deal of difference in terms of the space available, but it may not make a lot of difference in terms of understanding the general environment. Even the homes of the elite, in the homes of the elite, rich and poor were all jumbled up together, since slaves lived alongside their owners, and guests and clients of various stations would come and go. In addition, even if we are in a domus, a large private home, it was not located in a gated community. Instead, the domus would probably sit cheek by jowl with smaller dwellings, tenement dwellings, shops and baths and so forth. The room in which we are gathered was not dedicated for this purpose, to put it mildly. This was not sacred space as we think of it. We might be gathered in a triclinium, otherwise known as the dining room, hearing the letter read after a meal. Or we may be in the atrium of a large home, an area so open to the public that people could come and go, literally walking in off the street. Wherever we are, other gods are around us, especially if this is the home of a Gentile. As we enter the home, we will have passed the lararium, the shrine honoring the god of the household. And even if we are gathered in the home of Jews, we will have passed evidence of the gods on our way to the gathering and on our way home again. The gods were more ubiquitous than Starbucks, as ubiquitous even as chatter about the Republican presidential primaries, if you can believe it. As we listen, it is likely that some newcomers will arrive and that others will have had to leave. That some mother or wet nurse is nursing a baby without anyone being offended. In the distance, we may hear someone weeping over a new grief. We are in the midst of life. As I mentioned last night, one scholar who has worked on this question of the Roman household says we should think not of households, but of housefuls. There was nothing much that was private about the private home. One more thing. Most of these people probably do not read, but they do take in a lot of information by ear. Even those who could read often had things read to them, the antecedent of our book on CD or MP3. To me, at least, listening to this long letter without wandering to my to-do list or thinking about some other project or maybe thinking about dinner, that would be impossible. But this is a culture that is able to listen for a sustained period of time far better than many of us are. So if we can somehow imagine our way into the middle of this noisy, probably odoriferous mashup of humanity, listening to Phoebe read Paul's letter, what might we hear? Now here I am launching us entirely into a journey of the imagination. We have sources for reconstructing what a house might have looked like, what a gathering might have looked like, but none at all for reconstructing what people might have heard. Nevertheless, I want to suggest some possibilities. That is to say, to lift up some particular points and think together about what their resonance might be in a Roman setting. First, I suspect that many in Phoebe's audience were struck by the language of birth and death and resurrection. Talk about rebirth, like talk about light and darkness, is ubiquitous in most religious traditions, and for reasons that are entirely obvious. We are all born, we all die. And people in the ancient world lived in far more intimacy with both of those life passages than we do, and far less denial. It is exactly for that reason that Peter Oakes, whose work is on your handout, has suggested that Paul's audiences might have heard the discussion of resurrection not so much as escapism, but as promise, especially for those whose lives were in the present quite miserable. In addition, Romans 8 makes especially interesting use of the language of birth. In the second half of the chapter 8, Paul writes that the whole of creation, by which I think he means everything, people, animals, plants, the earth, everything that has been made, all of it longs to be freed for corruption, longs for freedom and the glory of God's children. We know that the whole creation groans together and is in labor together, and the word is the labor of childbirth. Both here and elsewhere, Paul uses maternal imagery when he describes his apostolic endeavors, and I've explored that a little bit in Our Mother, St. Paul. It's interesting to imagine how those texts might sound to women in Phoebe's audience. It is not at all unlikely that a birth is at hand somewhere in the neighborhood. If you've heard the cry of an infant interrupt a Christmas Eve service, you'll have the sense of juxtaposition, of real-life experience with the image. This is one of several ways in which Paul's interpretation of the gospel connects the small world, it's not small to us, our real life experience with the large world of the gospel. The giving of birth is here identified with the whole of creation. And of course, for new mothers and those who love them, birth is often experienced as just that, creation all over again. What Paul writes, however, is not a celebration of creation on its own. Instead, he says all of creation is in labor together, but then he twists his image. He doesn't say for birth, but for adoption. And he goes on then to say redemption. The language of giving birth yields to that of God's adoption of creation, God's redemption. It isn't that creation gives birth and rescues itself, but that God does it. Now, I know of at least one person who has heard me say this and who has concluded that I mean that we should sit around and wait for God to take care of the earth and not do anything about it ourselves. I am not saying that. Paul isn't simply talking about human abuse and destruction of the rest of creation. And even if he were, I assume he would interpret human action as a sign of God's redemption, not as a sign of humanity working on its own. That may come a little clearer in a few minutes. So, a second issue, a second feature of Romans that almost certainly would have attracted the attention of Roman Christians is Paul's use of the language of slavery. The letter to Romans, like that of Galatians, abounds in language of slavery and freedom. As Paul explains what has happened in the death and resurrection of Jesus, he interprets baptism as resurrection from the dead and freedom from slavery to sin. I'm reading from chapter 6. If we have been united with him, with Jesus, in a death like his, we will certainly be united with him in a resurrection like his. We know that our old self was crucified so that the body of sin might be destroyed and we might no longer be enslaved to sin. At this point, we might expect the conclusion Paul draws in Galatians 5. For freedom, Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. But in Romans 6, he does a different thing. That's not where he takes the argument. Instead, he goes on to claim that human beings continue to be slaves. Chapter 6 again. Do you not know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are the slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience, which leads to righteousness? He goes on, when you were slaves of sin, you were free with regard to righteousness, but now that you have been freed from sin and enslaved to God, the advantage you get is sanctification. The end is eternal life. Now, there are other places in the letter where he reinforces this notion, and they're often hidden from us in the NRSV. The NRSV rather politely translates Romans 12:11 as, do not lag in zeal, be ardent in the Spirit, serve the Lord. But a more literal translation would be a slave to the Lord. Again, in chapter 14, the NRSV says, the one who serves Christ. But actually what Paul says is, the one who is Christ's slave is acceptable to God. Now, our translations and we ourselves wince at this term slave, But Paul does not exempt himself from that word. He opens the letter by declaring himself a slave of Christ Jesus. Almost that's a part of his name, I think. Now, some have argued that this reflects the Hebrew Bible and the title of the Eved of Yahweh, the servant of God in the Hebrew Bible. And I wouldn't want to rule that out entirely, but I think it's fairly unlikely that Paul or his contemporaries could hear slave language without making connections to the actual slaves around them. Remember what I said, 40%. Among the philosophers, the popular teachers, the talking heads, if you will, of Paul's day, the admonition to be a slave to anyone, the claim that all are God's slaves, would have sounded quite bizarre. Slaves were the antithesis of the great-souled man that Aristotle so admired. In literary texts, they appear as buffoons. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus, with whom Paul is often compared, was himself a freedman. He had been a slave. And he advocated the notion that even in slavery we choose to be free. This is your own internal, what happens to your body is irrelevant. It's what you select, what you choose. That position is well known to those of us who, somewhere in junior high, memorized Richard Lovelace's To Althea from Prison, "Stone walls do not a prison make, nor iron bars a cage." Or worse yet, in my opinion, I hope this is no one's favorite, Invictus, "I am the master of my fate, the captain of my soul." Or ask any toddler, "You are not the boss of me." Paul sounds a lot more like Bob Dylan. You may be a carpenter or you may be a priest, but you're going to serve somebody. Written in his Christian period, which I think was about 2 weeks. I actually don't have a clue about that, but it's a great, if you don't know that, it is a great interpretation of Romans 6. So how does this discourse about slavery sound in the ears of Junia and her sisters? Among people who are either themselves slaves or who were slaves, whose families were imported as slaves. Women and men whose very bodies were at the disposal of their owners. It is risky even to venture an answer to that question, especially as I stand here as a free woman of considerable privileges Junia could not have imagined. But since I'm already out on this limb, I might as well bounce on it and see what happens. It's important to see how the language of slavery is transformed in Romans 8. One of the things that I'm beginning to appreciate about Romans after working on it now for more years than I'm going to confess is the intricacy of Paul's argumentation. He often uses a kind of rhetorical sleight of hand so that you think you're getting one thing and what's pulled out is another altogether. I think it's part of what we do when we're in a place. He doesn't know most of these people, so he's having to introduce himself. He's being a little careful. He may even know that he already has a bad reputation, so he's taking it, a little more carefully. In chapter 8, having emphatically identified Christians as slaves of righteousness, slaves of God, in the middle of chapter 8, he writes this: "Those who are led by the Spirit of God are sons and daughters of God. You did not receive a spirit of slavery again, slavery to fear. Instead, you received a spirit of adoption, by which we cry out, 'Abba, Father.' The Spirit itself testifies along with our spirit that we are God's children, and if children, then heirs, heirs of God and fellow heirs of Christ." Here, the slavery language gives way to the kind of familial language that Paul often uses for believers. Slaves and former slaves hear now that they are God's children, adopted into the household, and not just among the children, but elevated to be among the heirs. In the Roman world, slaves were occasionally adopted, but rarely would they be designated as the heir of the household. So this is what slavery to righteousness looks like. It looks like being a member of the family. Junia and her sisters will also have heard Phoebe address them as God's beloved, as people who are holy, who have been chosen by God, chapter 1 and again in chapter 8. They will hear in chapter 12 that they belong to Christ's own body and that they have been given spiritual gifts. In chapter 14, they will hear the claim that they belong to Christ's household and that the Lord of this household can cause them to stand, can support them. To us, these may sound like bloated, self-aggrandizing claims, even delusional. But I suspect, or I hope, that some in Rome will have heard them as rare words of love and acceptance. Where we hear them as troublesome assertions of power, designed to manipulate behavior, they may have heard them as words of protection, even comfort. A third motif: birth, death, and resurrection, slavery and freedom. A third motif that almost certainly stands out in their hearing is the language of Jew and Gentile. If we're right in thinking that most of these house churches were either predominantly Jewish or predominantly Gentile, that is, that they were not typically mixed congregations, it appears that there was at least some possibility, imagine that, for friction or distance or chill or conflict between the two. It may well be that some Jews resisted the inclusion of all these dirty Gentiles. I want to be very careful how I say that, because evidence about Jewish attitudes toward Gentiles in the ancient world is very complicated. But there are several places in Romans where Paul seems to bend over backward to make the point that God's action in Jesus Christ includes Gentiles as equal partners. Elsewhere in the New Testament, I'm thinking especially of Galatians and of Acts, there is evidence that not every Jewish follower of Jesus eagerly accepted that particular announcement. Second, it appears that, surprise, surprise, some Gentiles had already concluded that God's favor had been removed from Israel and transferred to them. And their heirs in the Christian tradition have been without number, to our utter shame. The evidence for this is quite direct in chapter 11. Paul writes, "Now I'm talking to you Gentiles. Don't boast over the branches. You don't support the root supports you." And a little further on, he reminds Gentiles that God has brought them in and God can take them out again. It's a familiar line to mothers in the room. At least in New Jersey, you hear that a lot. Third, Romans 14 suggests that it was probably around the common meal that these conflicts would take place. Some people, Jews as well as some Gentiles, thought that they should continue to observe kosher laws. Others, both Gentiles and Jews, did not. That's not a problem until we come together for a common meal. If the dinner is at my house and I insist on putting pork on the table, we have a problem. And although people ate very little meat, the most popular meat in Rome was, yes indeed, pork. Hypotheses about the situation of Jew and Gentile at Rome expand almost as rapidly as does the physical universe. And you'll be glad to know that I'm not going to try to give you a chart of all the proposals. What I will do is observe that Paul handles this complicated and challenging set of tensions with a remarkable deftness. Now, I know deftness is not a word we usually apply to the apostle, but I think it's appropriate here, as the course of the argument zigzags with great care, coming close at times to the Scylla of claiming that God really is the God of the Jews, and another time close to the Charybdis of saying God really now does side with the Gentiles. He avoids both of those, but he comes awfully close. Early in the letter, Paul very carefully insists that the gospel is for the Jew first and also the Gentile. So we see the tilt in that direction. And he plays on Jewish stereotypes about Gentiles in the second half of chapter 1. You know those people. They worship anything, and they'll sleep with anybody. And then he turns around and he pokes his finger in the eye of Jews as well, saying, tribulation and hardship is in store for everyone who does evil, the Jew first, and also the Greek. Several times he said, the Jew first, when it was good stuff, and now it's, oops. By the end of chapter 2, he has dismantled any distinction between Jew and Gentile, only to turn around at the beginning of the 3rd chapter and say, Jews have advantages in every way. Abraham is our father, he declares in chapter 4, but he was pronounced right with God while he was still uncircumcised. So he's going back and forth. Underneath this little dance, there is a kind of steady drumbeat. All. I often tell my students who are reading Romans with me in Greek, if you can just get one word, we'll be all right. It's an easy word. All are under the power of sin. All Israel will be saved, that you all may praise God together. So what will Junia and her sisters make of this? There's a great deal written on the question of Jewish and Gentile tensions in Rome, but I'm not aware of much reflection that considers the question from the point of view of gender. I suspect that the tensions will have expressed themselves in particular ways in the lives of women. If Jew and Gentile together praise God, does that mean that food preparation varies, at least for some? And how big of an issue is that in certain households? That sounds like a small thing to us, but it would not have been in the ancient world. Does the all imply that Jewish women may now marry uncircumcised Gentiles? Does the all include the women? Now, I've mentioned several features of Romans that have attracted or could have attracted the considerable attention of Junia and her sisters. And it may be that you are waiting for me to mention at least one more, Paul's notorious comments about sexuality in chapter 1. Comments about sexual relations, same-sex relations, that have played a huge role in contemporary church debate. I'm not trying to avoid that passage, although, frankly, I'd be happy for a moratorium on it. I simply don't imagine that Paul's contemporaries noticed that passage as much as we do. Now, that sounds really strange, but one of the things that makes the passage so difficult for us to understand is that it plays off of several cultural stereotypes that everyone would have known. In the Roman world, the sexual hierarchy has to be quite direct about it, with who penetrates whom. And men regain their place or keep their place in the sexual hierarchy by being penetrators, not penetrated. And women are not supposed to be penetrating anybody, so that's out of bounds altogether. Men who subject themselves to penetration have resigned their standing as real men. In addition to that whole anxiety about the sexual hierarchy, this text also reflects widespread anxiety about self-control and the fear that sexuality itself becomes out of control. And I think the text, as I've already said, plays on certain Jewish stereotypes about Gentiles. You know them, they eat anything, they worship anything, they sleep with anybody. And by the way, if I sound that way, there are many more stereotypes that Gentiles had about Jews. It's just that that's the way it works out in this particular text. And of course, Paul sets that up in order in chapter 2 to spring a trap, where he immediately says, those who judge others are also to be condemned. So much of this passage is standard in Paul's time that I think it's right to wonder how much specifically of his comment about sex, and that's not all that's in this chapter. In fact, I think it's mostly illustrative rather than fundamental to what he's arguing. But I wonder whether people even noticed much of what he has to say here about sex. It is possible that slaves heard this passage as a word of liberation. They may have heard this not as a blanket condemnation of same-sex relations, but as a condemnation of the way they were used by their owners. If you own someone's body, you use the body. Okay. I also imagine that the earliest audiences heard in Romans a claim about the vastness of the gospel. In a sense, that's implicit in what I've already said, the language of birth and death, of slavery and freedom, of Jew and Gentile. But let me spell this out a little bit more. My suspicion is that for most early Christians, the gospel was actually a pretty small thing, important in a limited sort of way. For many Jews, it was a renewal movement, a means of revival of the people of Israel. For many Gentiles, I think, those especially who were attracted to the synagogue, I think they saw this as a moment when the boundaries would come down and they could be identified as part of Israel without going through the full rite of conversion. For some of these Gentiles, and I think we would be surprised by their number, the God of Israel was a God to be served now alongside other gods. Proclamation about Jesus of Nazareth was one more observance to put on the shelf and to use to ward off bad things. The dominant mode of religiosity, after all, was a mode in which one added things, added observances, served more and more gods. One might have favorites, depending on who your people were and where they lived, but the exclusive observance of a single God was a pretty odd thing in the ancient world. This is why Jews and Christians are together lumped as atheists. Anyone who worships only one God is really pretty much a skinflint. And we tend to underestimate the continuing influence of the worship of the gods. But evidence for it dots the landscape of the New Testament. Whether I'm right about that point or off by a mile or several, Paul's letter to the Romans articulates an understanding of the gospel that is simply immense. Here I'm going to paint with a very large brush. But Romans assumes that the problem with the human community is that it lives under the illegitimate control of a number of powers, larger than human powers, powers that are themselves set over against God's rightful power. That's what he means when he talks about sin and death. he doesn't mean sin as in you did a bad thing. He means sin as in this power that was let into the world by Adam and that simply controls the world. This is why he uses in the latter such vivid imagery about sin and death, and about being, at times he talks about being weapons of rectification. He uses language drawn from warfare, talking about God's power over against these superpowers, really, of sin and death. It is striking to me that he talks, I think that's why the slavery language, being slaves to sin, is so powerful. It's striking that Paul never calls on people to change their ways and try harder. It's just not possible to do better on one's own. Here, the best analogy I have for those of a certain inclination is the Borg from Star Trek. Resistance is simply futile. Alongside that account, Paul tells of another power, the power of God. The letter opening equates the gospel with God's own saving power. When he goes back to unpack what he means by that, he says that God has put Jesus forward as redemption. That is to say, as the freeing, it's the words that's used for the freeing, the buying back of the slave. This is the same God who made promises to Abraham, who now in Jesus Christ has triumphed over sin and death. At the end of chapter 5, he talks about where sin increased, grace superabounded. So it's almost like if you'll pardon the expression, it comes close to being an arms race. The latter half of chapter 8 makes it clear that this conflict continues. Who will separate us from the love of Christ? And he declares in the face of all the evidence to the contrary that God will not let God's people go. And by the way, that means all people. There are no people who are not God's people. The conflict will continue, but in the meanwhile, it is God who enables and gifts and calls people into community. Now, how did all that sound at Rome? I suspect it may have been fairly unwelcome in some quarters. Not because he's talking about anti-God powers, really superhuman powers, but people wouldn't have found that strange at all. Just as talk about other powers, the demonic even, is not strange today in many parts of the world. We just think it is. Those who wanted the gospel to be a small thing, a supplement to other worships, an entry card of sorts, may have found this a bit odd, even offensive. But for others, this may have been a genuinely liberating word. After all, what is it worth to be told that you are valuable, that God is intent on rescuing you, that you have something in common with the whole of humanity, that God will fight for you? For people who knew their own powerlessness all too well, I suspect this was radically liberating. For us, the word is more problematic. The language of sin itself is troubling for those of us who grew up with a small, moralistic view of sin. As heirs of the Enlightenment and good Americans, we don't want much to come to grips with our own powerlessness. And acknowledgments of powerlessness are especially problematic for women. Claims that God has power strike many of us as projections about human power, especially destructive male power. And we worry especially because of the ways in which human beings have claimed for themselves the right to wield power in God's name or in God's place, something Paul does not do. But I think we might want to reconsider. Let me try an analogy, and then I'll close. I want to suggest that Paul's understanding of human life under the reign of anti-God powers looks quite a bit like what we know and are learning about the horror of the child soldier. In many parts of the world, children are swept from their villages or off the streets or traded by parents desperate for food or protection. They become little more than, if anything more than, slaves. Girls who are used for kitchen duty and sex, boys who wield weapons, both of them used as bait in conflict. In most cases, they are forced to become soldiers, and not just become soldiers, but eventually become the ones who capture and use others. There is no escape. In many cases, there is no thought of escape, as family has been destroyed and replaced, as unrelenting ideology takes over even their thoughts. They cannot help themselves. They cannot rescue themselves. The only power left to them is self-destruction and the eventual destruction of others. Child soldiers can only be rescued. They can only be redeemed. And that redemption must come by means of some kind of powerful intervention from the outside. I think what Paul shows us in Romans is not unrelated to that kind of dynamic, that we are all, in some sense, child soldiers. In such a conflict, in such a context, power is not to be rejected, especially when it is the self-giving power of redemption. Now, did Junia and her sisters notice any of these things? We are in the land of imagination. My hope, as maybe is clear, is that some of Junia's descendants will notice them and perhaps find that even Paul is worth listening to, after all. Thank you very much.